Good morning. I'm going to continue with Vimala's book on intensive self-education. And the next chapter is on sitting in silence. Sitting in silence. The question is, how can I, who am torn and fragmented, be in contact or have an intimate encounter with the totality? It is not possible on the mental level. Do what you will through the mind and its movement. Encounter with the totality is not possible. How does it come about then? First, verbally, you have to understand that the mind is not the relevant instrument. It is a relevant instrument to read a book or to acquire new ideas, but the movement of the mind is irrelevant as far as the exploration and encounter of the totality is concerned. This truth has to be understood. If this fact is grasped, then the desire, the temptation to use the mind and its movement for exploring the totality will no longer be there. So the grip of the mental movement is not so strong anymore. The insistence that I must find out God or reality through the mind subsides. It is quite an event, the realization of the frontiers of the mind. It's a turning point in man's life. The next question comes. What will happen if this constantly moving mind is allowed to stop? If the movement is not relevant, I let it stop. I don't control it, but I have a dialogue with myself and say, I can't reach beyond the word, beyond time and space with the mind. Whatever I bring in is fragmentary, and I may keep on doing it, but not to come to wholeness. So I let it relax. For the first time, there is the humility to let the mental movement go and let it relax. The humility is there to be in a state of non-action. The mind, because it has seen its own limitations, does not resist that state of relaxation, of non-action. If you force it, it will resist. But through the dialogue, when it has seen the truth, then without any resistance, it relaxes into the state of non-action or motionlessness, total relaxation. The unconditional and voluntary relaxation of this complex mind is the beginning of new life. It is there that the soil of your physical and psychological structure is prepared for the blossoming of the other. The total relaxation, the unconditional and voluntary relaxation of this complex mind is the beginning of the new life. It is there that the soil of your physical and psychological structure is prepared for the blossoming of the other. Observation. When we sit in silence, what do? We sit and observe the voluntary and involuntary activities of the body and mind. Slowly, the voluntary activities of the mind, of wanting things, attaining things, going outwards to get something, comes to an end. But the involuntary movements of the mind, which one has inherited from birth, from one's family, one's culture, one's religion, and one's nationality, these continue. So when one's eyes are closed, one notices the movement in one's own body. One notices the movement of breath going in and coming out. You feel the breath on the nostrils, in the chest. You notice the inhaling and exhaling of the breath, which you had not noticed before, though it takes place all the time. You begin to notice many sounds in the body. You don't create a problem out of that noticing. If you try to interpret those sounds, you will go back to the conditioned mind. The trap of the mind is the interpretation of the new that one notices in terms of the old. If one does not fall a victim to that trap, then those uninterpreted, unevaluated, uncompared, unjust sounds, unjudged sounds, are noticed for some time, and then one is no more conscious of them because the sounds have their own movement. The mind didn't create those sounds, they're just there. You're born with them. When one has become familiar with the movement of the sounds within the body, and one is no more conscious of them, or does not consciously pay any attention or importance to them, one goes to a different level of one's own being. Non-reactional observation. So education begins with observing and watching the mind. You sit before a mirror and physically watch yourself. There is no one else but you, and you watch your own reflection in the mirror. You are the looker, and you are that which is being looked at. So also in the mirror of solitude, one begins to watch the movement of the mind that is taking place within the skin, as it were. The senses are not busy looking away towards objects, and one is sitting quietly. However, the difficulty begins the moment one begins to watch or observe, because one has been trained to look only through a motive. We select our perceptions and select what we hear. We are inclined to look and listen where there is a motive that will benefit the ego. Every activity springs from an ego-centered motivation. So when one sits down to observe or watch, one feels helpless because the moment the thought arises and you look at it, the very act of perception gets polluted by the subjective reaction. This thought is good, that thought is bad. We've been trained to look for comparing, evaluating, accepting, and rejecting, doing something with the object of perception, something with the object of audition. We have not been educated to look innocently, just a reaction-free attentiveness, or a reaction-free perception. Before the chattering mind can voluntarily go into a state of non-action, one has to get acquainted with the nature of the mental movement. So the first hurdle is the incapacity to look innocently at anything at all, even for a fraction of a second. To look without rejection, acceptance, comparison, evaluation, and judgment taking place. There the learning begins, without being a doer, just to sustain that beautiful state of observation. Observation is non-reactional perception. The cerebral activity of the brain registers the nature of an object and gives it a name. This involuntary cerebral activity of receiving sensations and naming them takes place before you are aware of it. How does this happen? The eyes see everything in their path. The ears hear the variety of sounds, though you may not be listening, and the brain, the recording agency, refers it back to memory, finds and gives it a name, and unless a name is given, the brain will not be satisfied. This much happens in perception, but while this perception is taking place due to old habits, the subjective element of comparison and evaluation comes in and pollutes the perception and associates with the unit of perception, likes and dislikes, acceptance and rejection. Observation is an attentiveness, an alert sensitivity, where the subjective evaluatory reaction does not take place. It's a non-reactional perception, a non-reactional attentiveness. So one has to learn to be in a state of observation, of this non-reactional attentiveness. The whole life one has learned to be an actor, a doer, an experiencer, an evaluator. All this is left behind now, when with humility one learns to observe. It is a revolutionary breaking away from being a judge and an experiencer. One brushes aside all the authority of the past and of the past experience and knowledge, individual and collective, so that bare cognition takes place, so that pure perception happens. Perception is a happening. Listening is a happening. Voluntary division into the observer and the observed. In order to create a discipline in the process of looking, we willingly divide the conditioned consciousness, or the so-called me, into two parts. One is looked upon as the observer, and the other as that which is being observed. This is for learning only. The division is not an absolute reality, but in order to discipline ourselves, in order to discipline itself, the self-conscious thought mechanism divides itself into the observer and the observed. This is not a final division. When one has to learn how to observe, how to perceive in a reaction-free way, then this willingly, artificially created division in the conditioned consciousness subsides completely. There was no division, but we created it in order to learn. As you look at yourself in the mirror, the me is looking at itself in order to learn observation, to grow into the state of observation. But it is still the past, looking at itself. Please do see this. Observation is a state in which there can be a pure perception entirely free of the momentum of reactions. As we do not know this, as nobody has educated us in it, we have to do it for ourselves. That's why we call it self-education. Non-identification. As one notices the movement of thought, one may wonder why the thoughts come up and where they or the whole human past and experience and knowledge is located. The thoughts come up because they are the substance of your being. The past is engraved in you. It is engraved in the skin, in the flesh, in the plasma, in the bones, in the marrow. The whole human past, the thoughts, knowledge, experience, is incorporated in you, and it has its own momentum. As it moves, it gets exposed to your alert sensitivity. You look at it as you looked at the sounds innocently, without reacting. You look at it as you would look at the clouds of an evening sky or the birds in the sky. You won't be able to look at the thoughts innocently if you feel that this is my thought, my emotion, my sexual urge, my anger. If one has not previously investigated verbally and understood the mechanical nature of the movement of the mind, then one will be faced with obstacles. Because with every perception, there will be either excitement if one comes across something called good, or there will be a depression if one comes across something that is called bad. With every emotion that comes up, I will say, this is my emotion. And the ego will get hurt as it sees the lust and the anger within. We don't look at the lust, the anger, the violence as the movement of the total past in us. Instead, we identify ourselves with it, and therefore the looking, the observing, comes to an end. And with the ending of the observation, the investigation comes to an end. If one has inquired previously that the mind is the product of collective organized effort, and all the cerebral behaviors has been organized, standardized, and evaluated, ethically, religiously, politically, economically, norms and criteria have been created, and all this is contained in me. If one has really understood the fact of this and doesn't receive this as an idea, then one does not identify with what is exposed or feel it is my anger, my violence. The sense of minus disappears completely, so that the state of observation can be sustained. Observation and not imposition. When the thought moves and you note the movement of thought, you might ask, since the thought moves, what can I do? Nothing. You can't do a thing. It's part of the thousands of years of inheritance. With the intellect or the tiny little me, you're not going to stop the momentum of thousands of years. If I sit down and say, there is lust, there is anger in my mind, so with the help of some pious intention, I'm going to control it. It means I will have to divide the contents of the mind into the controller and that which is controlled. This is the classical way. The mind is its own content. It cannot be separated from its content. So the mind is its own content. It cannot be separated from its content. So how can I control it by means of vow or willpower? It cannot be controlled, for what is in the mind has a momentum of thousands of years, while the determination has only the power of 10 or 20 years. On a mental level, all the efforts to control the behavior of the mind have provided futile. You may think you have suppressed the habit, but every suppression, every denial takes its own toll in due course of time and in the body and mind. People who have tried to stop forcibly the momentum of the mind have mutilated their consciousness. Their minds have gone blank. They've lost the link with the world. We're not here to lose the link, either with the physical or the psychological. We are concerned with transcendence. We are not here to lose the link, either with the physical or the psychological. We are concerned with transcendence. So when thought moves and one notices the movement of thought, one has to be with that movement of thought, just watching it. It's not so easy, because the past jumps up and brings all its reactions. But at that time you say to it, "My friend, I don't need your help." So you become aware of the interference of the past, and again the watching takes place. Observing imbalances. In the state of observation, the past unfolds itself unto me, and together with the past, the imbalances also unfold themselves. The exposure of the imbalances to my attentiveness is a very desirable event. My being is stripped of all the must and must nots, the ought and ought nots. It is as if I'm looking at the mirror, and in the mirror of observation, the factual content of my being is revealed to me. To be able to see what is a great step. When such imbalances are exposed, if there is an authority of an ideology or a dogma or a theory of a person or a teacher, then out goes the state of observation of my psyche, and I begin to compare those imbalances with the ideal state where one moment. Okay. As again, a page has skipped a few pages, so let me read this again. When such imbalances are exposed, if there is an authority of an ideology or a dogma, of a theory or a person, of a teacher, then out goes the state of observation of my psyche, and I begin to compare those imbalances with the ideal state where imbalances do not exist. If I want to compare, to evaluate, to arrive at a conclusion of that which I'm observing, the whole past will come into play. The fact is compared to the ideal, and then there is conflict, there is a tension to reach out to the ideal from the fact of where we are. Or there is self-pity, or self-justification, or self-defense. So the state of observation is gone, and we are in a state of effort to obtain, to arrive, to capture. In the midst of observation, this is a kind of obstacle, an impediment that has come. Another obstacle is the I consciousness that is observing. Even if there is no comparison, no evaluation, no judgment, the I feels the tension of remaining in the austerity of observation. Observation is very austere. There is no fuss here, no emotions, no sentimentality about it. It is a non-subjective attitude which we have not been educated in. Observation being a state where the I cannot assert, the austerity of that assertion-free state becomes too much for me. I'm so used to react, to assert, that it becomes unbearable. The simplicity, the bareness of that state puzzles me, embarrasses me, and many an inquirer turns away from observation. But if that state is sustained and lived, then only the doors of the realm of silence get opened by themselves. If that state is sustained, then when we sit quiet and stop moving outwards and draw everything within, we are no longer involved in the roles of experiencer and actor. We now take up the role of observer and observe everything that is going through the mind. We watch all the past conditionings which are being aroused and coming up to the forefront of consciousness. We watch them without passing any judgment, without saying, I like this and I don't like that. Without questioning why they have risen and why they don't depart. There's no reaction at all to them. We just see them for what they are, without resisting or wishing to change or alter them. If one observes this way, then the thoughts will subside. The involuntary activity of the mind will come to an end, for these conditionings are not endless. They're not unlimited. Sometime or other, they will be exhausted. When there is nothing more to see, to observe, the mind is quiet. There is a sensing of a silence beyond the frontiers of the mind. Observation without the observer. When one has educated oneself in a reaction-free observation, and that state is sustained, then the whole vibrational thought structure loses its grip over you. Then the conditionings are no more the governing, the regulator factor, the regulating factor. Before it was the mind, the thought that was ruling supreme. It was the master, and it would make you dance to its tune. It would oblige you to give orders to your senses for gratifying its own feelings, sentiments, urges, and greeds. Mind was the master, a dictator. And really, mind is not a benevolent dictator. It's quite a tyrant. Observation equips you to sustain a non-subjective perception. So there is a space between that which is observed and the one that is observing. And through such education, one grows into the steadiness of perception. Perception is no more shaky, jumpy. It becomes total. It is no more fragmented or partial. It is only when the state of observation becomes steady and is sustained easily that the consciousness that one is observing disappears. Then there is a state of observation without the observer. That is to say, the I consciousness has emptied the whole content into the exposure that has taken place. The contents have been emptied, exposed, and therefore the division of the observer and the observed comes to an end. We had voluntarily divided ourselves into the looker and that which is looked at, the observer and that which is observed. We had divided ourselves into two parts, as it were, in order to look at ourselves, and as the contents were exposed, were emptied completely, without any resistance or distortion, the division comes to an end, and there remains only the flame of that state of observation. There remains observation without the observer, observation without a center. It's the flame of attentiveness that remains. You may be busy in the most difficult situations, but the flame of that attentiveness will be there. So in the beginning, we divide ourselves. I'm consciously learning to observe. Then I'm observing and thoughts come. Things are being observed. The me is not there, nor the conscious effort is there. You are no more observer when the state of observation becomes a normal state of consciousness all the time. When you sit down, there is a relaxation, no pressure of thought or emotion. There is no center that is observing, that is attentive. The individual consciousness or the conditioned mind has gone totally into non-action, non-movement. It's a state of motionlessness of the total past. This relaxation affects your whole body. It affects the brain, the breathing, the blood pressure, the digestive organs. This is a tension-free and pressure-free state, a state in which silence can be. It is only in the total cessation of the movement of the past that intelligence as an energy not inherited from the past or inherited from the parents or from the human race gets activated. One has to allow all this to happen within oneself. It just cannot happen because one is listening to the talks or reading the books. This is what I call education, and this is what you might call sadhana. This education is necessary for equipping the apparatus with this new faculty of sustained, non-subjective perception. So, till so far today, wish you a good day. Bye for now.